Welcome, everyone. We are so glad that you're here. My name is Bryan Schackmann. I'm the minister here at Glendale Church, and this is Dr. Justin Smith with me. Again, we'll be looking at the Gospel of Mark together. Before we begin, though, I just had a call from a lady from our church just a few minutes ago named Andrea, who's asked for prayer. She has some internal bleeding, and she's going to have a surgery tomorrow. So I told her that I would say a prayer for her, along with those in our church who are watching along with us right now. So let me say a prayer for Andrea right now. God, this is a hard time for so many people, and we pray your blessings over Andrea. She's in the hospital and scared. It's just a dangerous place to be, it seems, right now at a hospital. And I pray that you're with her and that the surgery goes well tomorrow and that she'll be healed and feeling better as soon as possible. So just please be with her, help her to know that we're praying for her and lifting her up. And I pray that the surgery goes really well tomorrow and that your hand will be on it. In your son's name I pray, amen.
Amen.
So we are going to be concluding today the Gospel of Mark study to the middle of the Gospel. Basically, we started in the first week talking about several verses in Mark chapter 8. And we're going to get to the middle of Mark chapter 8 today. Then we're going to hit pause on our study for a few weeks. I'm excited. Our associate minister, Lars Coburn, is going to get a chance to share a bit about a book that he wrote recently where he has 3 specific sections. So he's going to be talking about those sections with 3 members of our church, I believe. So it's going to be exciting for you to hear his thoughts. I've been able to start reading the book, and it's been enjoyable to get into some of his thoughts. I know Justin got a chance to read it as well. And so I hope you can tune in and join that discussion over the next several weeks. And eventually we will get back together and finish the Gospel of Mark. If you're missing us too much, you can go back and replay some of the old studies. People probably will. You can binge watch Mark. How cool is that?
Or not.
Or not, or just wait until there's fresh content. Eventually that will happen. But I have really enjoyed doing this study with Justin. I'm so thankful for everyone who is joining along with us. If you have any questions or you're watching this further down the line and you just want to know more about Jesus or more about our church, you can email me, Bryan@glendale.church, with anything that you have, any questions or comments. I'd love your feedback and thoughts. So we're going to start by looking at Mark chapter 7 with a very odd story. I might argue maybe the weirdest story in the Gospels. I don't know. It's one of those that there's some ways to try and explain it away, but I think it stands out a little bit like a sore thumb. So Mark chapter 7, starting in verse 24. Then Jesus left Galilee and went north to the region of Tyre. He didn't want anyone to know which house he was staying in, but he couldn't keep it a secret. Right away, a woman who had heard about him came and fell at his feet. Her little girl was possessed by an evil spirit, and she begged him to cast out the demon from her daughter. Since she was a Gentile, born in Syrian Phoenicia, Jesus told her, "First I should feed the children, my own family, the Jews. It isn't right to take food from the children and throw it to the dogs." She replied, "That's true, Lord, but even the dogs under the table are allowed to eat the scraps from the children's plates." "Good answer," he said. "Now go home, for the demon has left your daughter." And when she arrived home, she found her little girl lying quietly in bed, and the demon was gone. So Justin, I'd like you to unpack that one for me. The time that Jesus calls someone a female dog, which is not necessarily the slang that we would have associated with that today, but still a little bit troublesome. People say that, oh, he's using the term for a pet, and it's a term of affection, but he calls her a dog, so I think it's hard to get around that.
I think it is. I think it's difficult in a number of ways. One, I don't know that there were any really sort of positive connotations for dogs within Jewish culture. So within Greek culture, within Roman culture, the idea of maybe having a house dog or a lap dog or a pet dog, that might have resonated in a slightly different way. But I think from within Jewish culture, dogs were not really viewed positively. In fact, I think, if memory serves, there was a semi-popular prayer prayed by some that went along the lines of, I'm thankful that I was not born a Gentile, a woman, or a dog. And this was a semi-common Jewish prayer, maybe in the late 1st century and into the 2nd century. So the fact that all 3 of these actually kind of come together in this narrative, a Gentile woman who's referred to as a dog, sort of strikes, I think, at the heart in some ways of issues related to Jewish-Gentile interaction. So, one way that we've sort of traditionally read this is that this is a moment where Jesus is sort of testing this woman's faith. She comes through with flying colors, and then her daughter is healed. But I think for me, that's a really hard reading in a lot of ways. As a parent, you're a parent as well. Then also as a parent who's lost a child, to come to Jesus in this context as this woman does, and asking for mercy and asking for help for her child, and then to be rebuffed, really. I mean, for Jesus to say essentially, I'm not here for you. And then for her to push back, and that to sort of reorient Jesus in some way, or Jesus to be convinced by that. So even just from a human perspective, from a parent perspective, to have a sick child and to not really have answers and not know what to do, and to see this as an opportunity for someone to sort of be able to reach into your life and into this child's life, and to be talked to this way feels problematic to me in a lot of ways. And maybe another thing to think about too is, embedded in all of this, of course, as we've already talked about, are these Jewish-Gentile relationships. Jesus is as much a product of his time and place as we are, and I think sometimes we have our theology that pushes us in a direction of understanding Jesus that maybe we don't always find in the text. And what I mean by that is, Mark's gospel is really, really wonderful, I think, for how human Jesus is, and we've noticed this at various points. The kinds of things that Jesus says, what he does, how he gets frustrated. I mean, later on in Mark's gospel, we'll see Jesus get hangry, which I think is a very common thing for lots of us.
Yeah.
And here I see a Jesus who has purposefully gone into a Gentile region, hoping, I think, to not be recognized, hoping, I think, not to be bothered, hoping to get some sort of rest from the crowds that he never can seem to get away from in Mark's gospel. And precisely goes into this space, to be alone, to be away. And then there's this woman who comes to him, who I think really challenges some of Jesus's own boundaries. So as a Jewish man, to speak to a woman who's a single woman, who's not a member of your family, who you're not connected to, that's already problematic. The fact that she's a Gentile woman, that's already problematic. And so in Mark's gospel to this point, Jesus' mission has not particularly been a Gentile mission. It's been a very Jewish mission. Jesus is Jewish. The 12 are Jewish. It's a Jewish mission with Jewish people, generally speaking, in Jewish places of worship, and Jewish places and things and times of day and night, right? So this already is already sort of a narrative that's just full of all of these tensions. And I think Jesus' comments initially are, my mission is not for the Gentiles. And it doesn't feel as compassionate as we'd want it to be. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that it is, to be honest. I mean, I think
it's hard to make. It's one of those where you say, did he wake up on the wrong side of the bed? For me, it makes me think of how hard it is to actually love other people. Partly, I mean, I wonder if this is the humanity coming out a little bit of
100%,
that I'm a Jew, stay away, and that's like the gut response, and that honestly is, I think, how in some of our interactions with people, that's how we are. We like to love people who are just like us, and when it comes to having relationships with people who are from different backgrounds, who perhaps we were taught to be afraid of, or to have, like, this is like the knee-jerk response. And so it's Jesus, I think, showing a very human side and just kind of just responding, and it can't really be sanded away. It just sticks out.
I think it's problematic when we try to make it something other than it is, right? So this is, again, kind of where I think it comes back to where sometimes our theology overrides the text. And I think text and theology are always in this sort of interesting interplay. And I don't want anyone to think that I'm somehow anti-theology, because I'm clearly not. I deal with theology every day.
He's
in
got
my
Greek
work.
tattoos. I mean, come on.
I mean, I take my work home with me. So, but I think what we do then is we have these ideas about who Jesus is, and sometimes the text really challenges us to think differently about Jesus. And so, here we would always say Jesus is sinless, which I would absolutely agree with. And we have these ideas that whatever Jesus says and does has to be right because Jesus says it and does it, right? And yet there's something about this interaction where Jesus' initial response is, I'm not here for you. And this woman comes back with, that may be true, but I still need your help. And Jesus says, you're right. And I think it's a powerful moment because it shows us a Jesus who is not afraid to change, or not afraid to change his mind, or not afraid to be challenged, or not afraid to be shown an alternative direction or a different way. And I think that is as equally powerful as Jesus' sinlessness. For Jesus to be in this moment, because he is right and the woman is right. They're both right. That's the thing. Mm-hmm. Jesus' mission wasn't for the Gentiles yet. No. That's absolutely true. And he wasn't called at this point to be as open and inclusive of the Gentiles as he ultimately will be. That's also true. And she says, yeah, that's great, but I still need your help. Yeah, it's not right to feed, to give the food that's intended for the children to the dogs. She's like, yeah, but the dogs got to eat too. Mm-hmm. And Jesus says, you're right. And he's challenged. And I think as you and I were discussing before this, it then sort of sends Jesus in this interesting trajectory on his way back to Galilee, where he now goes into these Gentile spaces and he starts doing maybe not a full-fledged Gentile mission, but starts to do things in these Gentile regions that he has pretty much primarily been doing in Jewish spaces to this mm-hmm. point. And it comes, I think, in a lot of ways through this interaction that he has with this woman, this Syrophoenician woman who in many ways won't be denied. There's an old saying that I like to tell students all the time: a closed mouth don't get fed. The idea being, if you need something, you need to say something, you need to talk, you need to tell me. Mm-hmm. I'm pretty good, and I imagine you're pretty good at anticipating lots of people's needs, but we can't always anticipate everything. We need to be told, we need to be reminded. Sometimes we need to be asked. Sometimes we have our own blind spots as we're trying to care for people, as I'm trying to care for students. So I constantly am trying to remind students, I'm like, talk to me, tell me, what do you need? Mm-hmm. And this woman essentially stands there and says, I need to be fed too. And Jesus goes, yeah.
Yeah,
you're right.
And it really, I think, opens up a trajectory. It's interesting because basically everyone's in agreement that the Gospel of Mark was written first, and then Matthew and Luke copied. You see story after story where they clearly were copying things, and they were the first plagiarists. Plagiarism happened a lot, but they're definitely leaning on this story. And Matthew,
there's an homage to Mark in Matthew and Luke.
And Matthew keeps this story in there, but then Luke's like, that's just a little too weird. So if you at home think, whoa, I've never heard Jesus talk like this, or this story has never been preached on, you're in good company because it's strange. And for Luke actually to not include it is somewhat shocking because he is so much talking about the outsiders and women specifically, lifting them up. But for Luke, it's just like this one is just too strange. Yeah. And sometimes I think this kind of thing teaches us the importance of sitting in the tension of the text, mm-hmm. and that we don't know really. Yeah. And what you said, sometimes we like to just erase it all away and make it a little more comfortable and palatable. And oh, well, Jesus is just this compassionate love guy, but it's pretty awkward here, and it's a little strange. And he does seem, I would say, change his mind, that he's a little bit tired. He's not about that mission yet. And then it's like, all right, I guess God has called me to this. And he's, I think, moved by her understanding of what's going on, because he's been telling parables and stories, and with his disciples, it's like, are you so dull? And he gives her a very vague, very short parable about the dogs and all that stuff, and she gets it right away.
Yeah.
And she just goes, "Hey, yeah, that's true. You're this and that's," and she just jumps right into that.
Yeah.
And I think there's something about that then does open up a floodgate kind of to this ministry.
Well, and I also think it's interesting that over and over in Scripture, we see the way that God speaks to us or the way that God speaks to others in the most unlikely of ways, right? So, I mean, is it Elijah who, hears God in the still, small voice? It's not in the earthquake. It's not in the thunder. It's not in all the places you would expect. It's here. It's Moses in the burning bush, not what you would expect. It's the way that even, Jesus at various points in his ministry will recall instances in the life of Israel where God sort of demonstrates and shows his power and his grace and his love to the most unlikely of individuals. And here you have God's voice, I think, God's challenge, God's reorientation coming not through Jesus as the story opens, as this narrative opens, but through this Gentile woman who, in this relationship, in this sort of interpersonal moment between her and Jesus, is the disempowered, the outcast, the outsider, the other, who is coming to him in a place where she's in need. I mean, she's begging, like literally in the text it says she's begging Jesus, and his response is, "I'm not here for you." And she says, "You may not be, but I still need you, and I still need your help." And that reorients. And I think we can't be afraid to be reoriented, and we can't be afraid to find where God is speaking to us in the most unlikely of ways and unlikely of places sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. And then his ministry continues in Gentile territory. I'll go ahead and read from Mark chapter 7, verse 31, all the way into Mark chapter 8, verse 8. So Jesus left Tyre and went up to Sidon before going back to the Sea of Galilee in the region of the 10 towns, the Decapolis. A deaf man with a speech impediment was brought to him, and the people begged Jesus to lay his hands on the man to heal him. Jesus led him away from the crowd so they could be alone. He put fingers into the man's ears. Then, spitting on his fingers, he touched the man's tongue. Looking up to heaven, he sighed and said, "Ephphatha," which means "be opened." Instantly, the man could hear perfectly, and his tongue was freed so he could speak plainly. Jesus told the crowd not to tell anyone, but the more he told them not to, the more they spread the news. They were completely amazed and said again and again, "Everything he does is wonderful. He even makes the deaf to hear and gives speech to those who cannot speak." About this time, another large crowd had gathered, and the people ran out of food again. Jesus called his disciples and told them, "I feel sorry for these people. They've been here with me for 3 days, and they have nothing left to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will faint along the way, for some of them have come a long distance." His disciples replied, "How are we supposed to find enough food to feed them out here in the wilderness?" Jesus asked, "How much bread do you have?" 7 loaves, they replied. So Jesus told all the people to sit down on the ground. Then he took the 7 loaves, thanked God for them, and broke them into pieces. He gave them also to his disciples, who distributed the bread to the crowd. A few small fish were found too, so Jesus also blessed these and told the disciples to distribute them. They ate as much as they wanted. Afterwards, the disciples picked up 7 large baskets of leftover food. There were about 4,000 people in the crowd that day, and Jesus sent them home after they had eaten. Immediately after this, he got in a boat with his disciples and crossed over to the region of Dalmatia.
Yeah, well, I mean, some interesting things here, certainly as we start. I think this instance of curing the deaf man is really sort of intriguing, mainly because of the methodology employed.
The wet willy?
Yeah, it's not entirely out of character for what Jesus will do at various points when healing and performing miracles, but typically I think when we see Jesus healing, he heals with word. Sometimes there's laying on of hands or physical touch, but this is sort of an interesting moment, yeah, where he's very hands-on in this healing, fingers and ears, touching of the tongue. So yeah, I mean, I suppose some of this probably again has to do with boundaries and boundary crossing, and the way Jesus is moving beyond boundaries. So as you noticed, he's in a Gentile space. So now he would be appearing then to touch this Gentile man, which itself would have been problematic, which itself would have made Jesus unclean. To be in a Gentile space, first of all, is already a problem, and then to be in this kind of close proximity would also be a problem. Social distancing, if you will, would have been the call for the day as it related to Jewish-Gentile interactions. And so maybe this narrative coming right after this encounter with the Syrophoenician woman is a really powerful moment where, if we're imagining now that Jesus' ministry is sort of being reoriented in a way that is more inclusive of Gentiles, maybe not a full-blown Gentile mission, but more inclusive, then it's interesting the way that Jesus is traversing these boundaries through touch and through intimate contact in this way. And then I just think that verse 37 is really interesting. He has done everything well. He makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. I mean, yeah, I mean, it feels like it's underselling the moment just a little bit, but yes, he has, he's done everything well. So I think the sort of praise that he gets here is pretty fantastic too.
Yeah, and I think it's always symbolic, the healings that he's doing, that it's about helping people to see, helping people to speak in the right way. And then the feeding of the 4,000, I've always, before studying the Gospel of Mark, I was like, wow, why is there another one of these? Like, it's just a few chapters later, we just saw it, so why? And in my reading and some of my research for our study, some of the books I was reading are saying that this is about that Gentile thing, that it's basically Jesus is doing the exact same thing he was doing for Jews in Gentile territory.
Yeah.
And that is unbelievable. It's huge news, and the idea that he is not just going to be there for the Jewish people and they are going to set up some sort of government and run things from there. No, Jesus gives out bread freely. He gives bread to every person, and he continues to do that. And that is something that I think it's foreshadowing, because Peter doesn't get this until later, basically, that he has to have the vision in Acts. And this is what Jesus was about. He was not uncomfortable being around unclean people and people who he would have been told to have suspicions about. And this is such a different time where you don't do a whole lot of traveling outside of basically where you're from.
Yeah.
You don't, take a trip to Europe for fun. It's you don't do that. You stay close to your family. You stay where you are. You live into your traditions. As a Jew, you stay close to your temple. Like, this is what you do. And Jesus is just going and doing stuff. Oh, there's a sick person here. All right, I'll help out. And that super odd story with the woman where he's a little bit rude to her seems to open his heart in a way to this is a part of my calling too. And it's like this checklist that Mark is giving us. Like, he did this in Jewish territory, he did it in Gentile territory. He did it in Jewish territory, he did it in Gentile territory. And that is something that I think is a message that we really need to wrestle with and continue to think about as we continue to see racism in our country very obviously still today. Just yesterday, things going viral, and it's one of those things that I think we can sometimes think that we're over, but Jesus is going to want us to recognize that this is our calling, to break down the walls that exist between us and to be pushing those barriers down instead of leaving them up, and be willing to look at it. Where do I have that hate in my own heart? Yeah. Where do I have these things? Because again, I think that story with the woman, it almost is like that's Jesus's knee jerk, and I don't do that for you. And then his heart is somewhat open, like, oh, I can do this. And we need that heart softening as well.
I mean, I think what we start to see, in some ways after this encounter with the Syrophoenician woman is even a deepening of Jesus's compassion, if that's even possible. And I think it is. I mean, the way that he moves into these different spaces now and is demonstrating compassion in a way that maybe has gone to deeper levels than what we've seen before. And I think the other interesting thing here, too, is, we explored a bit back with the casting out of the demon and the Gerasene demoniac and some of the anti-imperial imagery there, and him doing that in a Gentile space as well, and sort of how that maybe relates to the kingdom of God in some way. But I think what we're continuing to see, especially as we sort of dive a little bit deeper into his interactions with Gentiles, is that Jesus is starting to move in the direction of modeling a kingdom where oppressor and oppressed both find freedom. And I think this itself is a real challenge even to the first century Jewish worldview, which was we're crying out to God for justice, we're crying out to God for redemption, we're crying out to God for king and kingdom, and part of that king and kingdom is destroying our enemies. It's destroying the oppressor. Mm-hmm. It's modeling king and kingdom like the kings and kingdoms of the world, except God is at the head of it. But it's the same basic pattern of destruction. It's the same basic pattern of pain and suffering, only we're not the ones suffering. Mm-hmm. And Jesus begins to model for us a kingdom where the oppressor and the oppressed go free. And we see that in this, the beginning of this sort of reconciliation of these spaces where Jesus brings, this freedom, this redemption, this salvation into Jewish spaces. Does he need to be reoriented at some point? Absolutely. And the Syrophoenician woman, I think, is a really interesting pivot point, maybe for the whole gospel of Mark in some ways. But it's then this vision that says we don't defeat oppression by modeling the actions of the oppressor. Mm-hmm. The way that we defeat oppression is by doing things differently. And so Jesus, I think, is beginning to model. I mean, of course, he's done this already, but now, especially as he's moving into these Gentile spaces and having these interactions, we're seeing a new way that this incorporation of the oppressor into this freedom, where reconciliation is beginning to take place, is happening here. And we see it, like you said, it's first the woman says, I need to be fed too, and Jesus says, you're right. Then this man is healed, and this idea of be opened. That language that Jesus uses is sort of interesting. Yeah. I almost wonder if it's not only for the man and for the people who are gathered, but even in some ways for Jesus, as he's sort of reminding himself of the ways that he needs to be opened and open to these new experiences, and then feeding.
I think that a great line that goes along with just what you're saying is, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and Herod, which is the idea of the exactly what you're saying. Like, okay, well, once we get in charge, then and we're going to press things differently. And the Pharisees had the idea of creating basically this religious state, and the Jewish people, being in charge and everything, and then it'll be better. And then obviously Herod is political power, and politics will fix it. And I think that both of those things can be important if used in the right way and with humility. But Jesus is saying, beware of either people who are trying to get you to use some sort of system of power to keep people. And I mean, the Pharisees obviously use it differently than Herod. We see them throughout this gospel meddling with Jesus and trying to get him to do things correctly, because their way of power was following rules correctly. And then Herod's way, we've seen the beheading of John the Baptist just a couple chapters ago, where that's what that political power looks like. And you're exactly right. Jesus is trying to say, I'm doing something completely different here. I'm giving bread not just to Jews. I'm giving bread to Gentiles. I'm doing this ministry, and I'm called to be a blessing to all people. And that is really challenging, and still to this day remains a challenge, and something that we need to continue to check our biases and our heart, and ask hard questions of ourselves at times. I think something that, because really this trajectory that Jesus then, I'd say, sends Christianity on is worked out throughout the whole New Testament. Because how do Jews and Gentiles get along? How many converts to this new movement of Christianity are you going to get if the guys have to get circumcised? And it seems like a small new converts class. So
very small.
have some difficulties. Like, what does that look like? Because that's a core belief. This is like who we are. This is how we're identified. And we suddenly have to figure that out with a different group of people. So that's really much of the New Testament that Jesus, I think, starts his trajectory on. And I think we need to recognize just how hard this is to do in ourselves. And it's about continuing to break down walls and barriers. One thing I heard a while back that always sticks with me, because I think the general ethos of today, of the kind of young, modern type person, is, I just love everybody everywhere. And loving everybody everywhere is a real great way to not actually love any people really anywhere. Like, I just love everybody. Okay, cool, great. Well, like, who different than you do you regularly eat with? And who that's like radically different than you do you have some sort of community with? Because it's hard. Even for Jesus, it's hard. Jesus sees her. He's like, nope, not for you. And it's like, oh, wait, I guess it can be for you. It's this moment for him. It's hard even for Jesus. This type of diverse community is difficult, but yet it's what we're called to. And it's not just by sitting at home and liking certain things. It's actually lived out. It's embodied.
Yeah. Well, I think part of this, too, is maybe the way that we haven't dealt effectively with personal trauma and community trauma. And I think some of what we miss from these narratives, some of what we miss in the Gospels, what we miss in Jesus' own context, is hundreds and hundreds of years of Jewish trauma. Trauma at the hands of the Romans, trauma at the hands of their own leaders, trauma at the hands of the Greeks, of the Persians, of the Babylonians, of the Assyrians. So there's this long-standing, centuries-old mistrust of Gentiles, this difficult relationship and difficult power dynamics. And all of a sudden now, Jesus is coming into this space, and he is calling his own people to work through their trauma in a way that I don't think that they're necessarily prepared to yet. And I think for many of us too, as we're sort of seeking to work into new spaces and incorporate into diverse communities, or to diversify our communities, oftentimes, if we're not careful and we're not working through our own trauma and talking about it and being honest about it and doing so effectively, then we end up with just this kind of thing was, I love everyone everywhere. Okay, well, but what does that actually look like lived out? And for many of us, we then struggle to live it out because we haven't dealt with it effectively. Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of what we miss, again, is that this idea of a broadening and expanding of the community to include Gentiles is really pushing against hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of Jewish self-identity, but then also oppression and trauma. And I think what it does then is it also opens up for us the possibilities to see just how reconciling a faith in Jesus Christ is. And it's one that reconciles in a way that's not just internal, but one that reconciles communities to one another, right? Oppressor and oppressed. And I think we need to be sort of working more in those circles as well, sort of pushing beyond our own hurt and trauma, while dealing with it effectively as well, as we start to think about what it looks like to expand this vision.
And I think that this, in an interesting way, gives us a little bit of a roadmap to what this looks like in a standpoint that obviously we can't do the miracles that Jesus did, but sure. This is stuff that is without miracle in some ways. Yeah. Thinking of the feeding of the 4,000, sitting and eating meals with people that are different than you, like listening, hearing their stories, being empathetic, and being able to share and like have those meaningful conversations. Touching a tongue. And when was the last time you touched somebody who had different skin color? I think we asked those questions. And it's obvious coronavirus, say you have a little bit of a
I was going to say, I haven't touched a lot of people in a long time.
Coronavirus, you have a bit of a past. But I think in normal times, how often are you in like physical space with people in those ways? Then the conversation with the Phoenician woman, it's awkward. It's a little, there's no other word for it. It's strange. It's a little bit hard. I know for me, one of the things I'm proud of our church is the diversity of our community, and I want to continue to grow in that way. But I know I'm blessed that I get feedback from people of all kinds on sermons and conversations. And there's one time that one of our members of our church, who is black, I had preached a sermon, and she told me a few days later that I had said something about how America started out with this vision of equality for everybody, and she was like,
Not so
"No,
much."
not so much." And it was, and
Yeah.
I'm so thankful that she said that to me,
Yeah.
because that could have been something that she, kind of buries down in her own heart,
Right.
and I am genuinely thankful for when I get any sort of feedback that helps me to see perspectives of other people. And when it comes to talking all the time, there's going to be things that you say,
Right.
or just in any relationship. And to this woman, like, kind of continuing to press into the awkwardness of this conversation, and then it actually changing, and Jesus turning, I think, a little bit more into the Jesus that we would expect and love and know. That's something that we need to recognize. So I think there's a bit of a roadmap where it's conversations, it's meals, it's the touch, and we need to be challenged by this, because this is so hard for New Testament churches, and is still a struggle for us today. How do we find some ways to break down barriers that exist in our heart and be honest about those things?
I mean, I think the thing is, we all have blind spots. The question is, what do we do when we're alerted by others to our blind spots? And I think Jesus in this moment has a blind spot. He has an orientation toward a Jewish mission as a Jewish Messiah to bring hope and truth and the kingdom to his people. And the blind spot is the one right before him. And this woman says, I need you too. I need your help too. And Jesus could be like we often are when presented with a blind spot. We just, nope, that's not the case. Sorry, I don't know what you're talking about. Your comments are wrong, and I don't think that way. No, Jesus hears her, he sees her, and recognizes that blind spot, and then immediately lives in a way and moves in a way that I think shows that blind spot has been seen, and he's aware of, and he's correcting. And so I think it's not so much about not having blind spots or removing all of our blind spots, because I think that's impossible.
Yeah.
It's, what do we do when our blind spots are pointed out? Do we lean into that space with humility and grace and openness, with a heart of compassion and reconciliation, and say, you're absolutely right, I need to learn from you, I need to be corrected, or I need to hear or to be challenged? Or do we become defensive and either shut ourselves down or shut others down?
Yeah, and I think it's a challenge for us to think through that, and we need to constantly be willing to say, all right, where are some things that I need to work on, and how am I growing in my love truly of all people? Because Jesus shows us this. All right, I'm going to do the exact same things that I did for the Jews, I'm going to do them for the Gentiles, and that's, I think, who we're called to be. Yeah. So we are pretty much done there with the first 8 chapters of Mark. What's a reflection as you've gone through this study again, looked through these chapters one more time?
I think one of the reasons that I've always loved Mark's gospel is precisely because of how human Jesus is in Mark. I think for many of us, myself included, most of my life, my relationship to Jesus was with the resurrected Jesus and the ascended Jesus and the Jesus that sits at the right hand of the Father. And I think that's a Jesus we need to be in a deep relationship with as well. But it wasn't really until I started doing more academic study, and really when I kind of turned my attention to Mark at various points, that my relationship with Jesus really blossomed and developed, because I could see Jesus as human, like truly human, flesh and blood, like me, definitely way better than me, but like me, and it gave me hope. And the first 8 chapters of Mark continue to give me hope as I see a Jesus that we are called to be like. Jesus models this thing that we call discipleship, and he models this thing that we call kingdom. And I think we see it beautifully in the first 8 chapters of Mark. Like, we just get these wonderful moments where Jesus draws us in to what it looks like to be a human being as God intended it.
Yeah, and I like to. We started this right at the beginning of COVID-19, not really knowing how long this is going to go, but our hope was to just reorient ourselves and anyone who joined us for this study to a good picture of Jesus. And I think you're exactly right. The humanity, the fact that he's able to do miraculous things, which remind us to recognize that even as we go through storms, that God is with us, but that humanity is so present, and I'd say it's simple. There's times that it's challenging, and there's some things that we definitely walk away with, but there's also a simplicity to the picture that Mark gives us that I think is really, really beautiful.
Yeah, I agree.
So we are out of time this evening. Thank you for joining us. As I mentioned, starting next week, Lars will be talking a bit about his book, and I hope that you can join in for that discussion. And we will be back eventually to finish up Mark's Gospel, which I'm excited to do at some point with Justin. Justin, thank you so much for your time. It's been fun to do this over the last few months, and I'm looking forward to being back together with you in a little bit.
I'm looking forward to it.
And I hope that if you have any questions or need anything, you can contact me, Bryan, with a Y, at glendale.church. Let me know if you have any questions, anything that you need some clarity on, or just you're going to know a little bit more about Jesus. I'd be happy to help you out with that. I hope you guys have a great evening. You're welcome to join in. Lars, the guy who'll be teaching next week, is doing a Zoom call starting in just a few minutes, which you can find at glendale.church/connect. You can join in on that call for a time of prayer. Hope you guys have a great night.
You're still here? It's over. Go home. Go.